I am Madison Cole, 36, and while my family still mocks me as nothing more than a seamstress, I am the woman running Guardian Elite Security in Los Angeles, trusted with protecting Hollywood stars. Last night at the plaza, my sister looked me in the eye and called me trash in front of everyone. But what she never knew was that the very same night my phone buzzed with a mission from the Academy Awards, a contract worth millions that would shatter her perfect stage. I landed in New York the night before the wedding and walked into the plaza with my suitcase rolling behind me. The chandeliers above shimmered like ice, and the air carried that mix of money and perfume I remembered from childhood gatherings where I was never really part of the picture. I told myself I could survive one dinner, just one night of polite smiles, and then back to my real life in Los Angeles. The welcome dinner was already buzzing when I stepped inside the ballroom. Olivia stood at the center in a satin gown the color of champagne, Kyle at her side, their friends circling like satellites. I barely reached the table chart when her voice sliced through the music. My sister just a seamstress? A trash worker? A ripple of laughter spread around them. I felt the heat crawl up my neck, but I kept my face still. Robert adjusted his cufflinks and avoided my eyes. Eleanor leaned toward the flowers as if rearranging a ribbon mattered more than the insult that had just hung in the air. Not one word of protest. I searched for my name on the seating board, already knowing where I would find it. At the very back. A planner with a clipboard guided me with a tight smile. Table 15 near the bar. The tablecloth was wrinkled, the silverware mismatched. From where I sat, I could hear the servers rushing through the service doors. Guests looked at me, and then turned back quickly as if I was furniture. When the photographer called for family photos, I stayed seated. Flash after flash went off, and I was not in any of them. I remembered being 12, sitting in a school auditorium, watching Olivia stumble through a dance routine, while the crowd cheered as though she was perfect. I had stayed up the night before stitching rhinestones on her costume. No one thanked me. That same old sting pressed at me now, but I pressed it down. I left before dessert. My heels echoed against the marble floor as I crossed the lobby toward the elevators. Behind me, laughter spilled out of the ballroom. Inside the mirrored elevator, I finally let my shoulders drop. The phone in my clutch vibrated. A message from my operations lead in Los Angeles lit the screen. Oscar team requests confirmation. Mission A. Urgent. My lips curved into a sharper smile, cold and certain. The sister they mocked as a seamstress was the same woman who held the security of Hollywood stars in her hands. I typed one word, confirmed, and slid the phone back into my clutch. The elevator rose, humming steadily. I fixed my reflection in the mirror. Eyes clear, spine straight. Let them laugh. Let them pose for pictures without me. They had no idea what I had built in the years they dismissed me. The doors opened to a quiet hallway, and I stepped out into silence that felt heavier than the noise I had just left behind. Outside, New York glowed with windows and traffic, the city pulsing with its own rhythm. I walked forward calmly, heels striking an even rhythm, already knowing this night was only the beginning. When I was 20, I lived in a cramped walk up on the south side of Chicago, the kind of place where the windows rattled when the L passed and the radiator hissed all night. By day, I tried to keep up with classes at a community college. By night, I stitched until my eyes blurred. The sewing floor smelled of steam and fabric dust, and the hum of machines went on until dawn. My back ached, my fingers blistered, but the rent had to be paid, and the tuition bill did not care that my parents only sent money for Olivia's lessons and gowns. I never told them where I disappeared to each night. To them, I was the dependable daughter, the one who did not ask for much, the one they could forget, while they bragged about Olivia's recitals and pageants. They paraded her in sequins while I dragged myself home with lint clinging to my clothes. I kept my head down, thinking maybe if I worked hard enough the ledger would balance someday. One night, a woman slammed a half-finished dress on the counter, shouting that the seam was crooked. I swallowed the sting in my throat, apologized softly, and picked up the scissors again. The clock read 3 in the morning, but I kept cutting, sewing, ripping, and starting over until the garment lay smooth under the dim light. No one patted my shoulder. No one saw the tears I wiped away with the back of my hand. What those nights gave me was discipline sharper than any needle, a patience that could outlast humiliation. Sometimes I would leave the factory as dawn broke and pass the polished glass front of a private security office down the block. Men in dark uniforms moved in formation, their steps heavy and sure. The sight always made me pause. They looked nothing like the women hunched over machines in my building. They looked untouchable. I remember stopping one morning, the cold biting my cheeks, watching a drill through the window. Something flickered inside me. I realized the work I was doing was not my destiny, only training. Every stitch was teaching me endurance. Every insult was sharpening my resolve. I started saving scraps of my paycheck, tiny amounts tucked away in an envelope under my mattress. Between classes and shifts, I read books about criminal justice, studied reports about crisis management, and watched documentaries on protection work. My classmates thought I was just another tired girl trying to finish credits, but in my head, I was already planning a different future. There were nights I stumbled back to my apartment, collapsing onto the mattress with bruised hands, and wondered if I was crazy to dream beyond that sewing floor. Yet every time I remembered Olivia's laughter, her dresses bought with money I had quietly sacrificed, I pushed harder. I would not remain the shadow daughter forever. The memory of those years sat with me now in New York, the glitter of the plaza still clinging to my clothes. They thought I had stayed small, still bent over a machine. They had no idea that those long nights in Chicago were the furnace that forged me. I checked my phone again in the quiet of my hotel room, the confirmation message from Los Angeles still glowing. Tomorrow would not be about seamstresses or insults whispered across linen tablecloths. Tomorrow was about power I had built in silence, power my family could not begin to imagine. And the stage where they planned to humiliate me again was the perfect place for the truth to crack open. In 2020, the Los Angeles courthouse loomed like a fortress of stone and glass cameras clustered on the steps as if waiting for a celebrity scandal. I tightened the cuffs of my gray suit and walked through the crowd with Jason Miller, my attorney, and one of the few people I trusted. 5 years earlier, I had built Guardian Elite Security from a rented office and a handful of loyal recruits. By then, we had more than 200 employees' contracts with studios and teams assigned to actors whose names filled billboards. But one man still tried to drag me back into the shadows. Connor Hayes leaned against the railing outside the courtroom, a smirk plastered across his face. He had once been a minor partner, offering consulting services in the company's early days. Now he claimed he had been cut out of what should have been his empire. As I walked past, he tilted his head, voice dripping with contempt. "You were just the girl who stitched hems in Chicago. How do you think you can control Hollywood?" I did not answer. Jason placed a steady hand at my back and guided me inside. The air in the courtroom was tense, reporters filling every bench. Connor's lawyers spoke first, painting a picture of betrayal, saying I had tricked him into signing away shares. I listened, hands folded on the table, heart beating steady. When it was our turn, Jason rose, unfolding documents, contracts, and filings. Every paper bore my name as sole owner. Connor had been compensated as a contractor, nothing more. Then I stood, meeting the eyes of the judge. I spoke calmly about the years I spent building the infrastructure, about the licenses under my name, about the risks I alone had taken. I did not need to raise my voice. The truth was in black ink. Connor grew restless, tapping his pen, glaring at me with the same disdain I had endured years before in Chicago. He wanted me to flinch, to lose my composure. I never did. The judge read through the files, lips pressed thin, then set them down. The sound of the gavel striking the bench echoed through the chamber. "The claim is dismissed." For a moment, the room went silent. Connor's jaw tightened, the color draining from his face. Reporters scribbled furiously. Jason leaned toward me, whispering, "It's over." We walked out together into the crush of cameras and microphones. Flashes burst against my eyes, questions hurled in rapid fire. "Did you trick him? Was the company ever his? Are you celebrating?" I stopped on the top step, straightened my shoulders, and let them take their pictures. I said only one thing. The law is not a weapon for ambition. It is the instrument that protects the truth. Then I moved forward, leaving Connor swallowed by the crowd. That night, I sat in my office, the city glowing outside the window. My staff was still working late training for a major premiere event, moving with precision and loyalty. Connor had tried to claim what he never built, and the court had stripped his pretense away. I knew he would not vanish quietly. Men like him never did. The papers on my desk reminded me of the next morning's briefing, a contract that would change the scale of everything we had done. While Connor fumed in defeat, I was preparing to step into an arena even larger, where failure was not an option, and every move would be scrutinized under the brightest lights. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the restaurant, bouncing off silverware and champagne flutes. The pre-wedding brunch was Olivia's chance to parade herself before the family and Kyle's colleagues. I slipped into the room a few minutes late, knowing my name would not be near the head of the table. Sure enough, the hostess guided me to the far end, a small seat tucked between a service station and the exit. From there, I could watch the performance unfold. Robert raised his glass, his voice steady but sharp. Olivia is the future of this family. She will carry the Cole name and the assets. He listed them like inventory: the house in Westchester, the retirement accounts, the portfolio of shares he had collected over decades. Eleanor smiled approvingly, her pearls glinting in the light. I felt their eyes skim past me as though I was furniture. Olivia leaned across to Kyle, her fingers brushing his sleeve in a display of intimacy. She turned her gaze toward me, her smile sweet and poisoned. Someone like you does not need an inheritance. You belong with a needle and thread, not accounts and deeds. The table chuckled politely, not daring to break the script. I sipped the flat champagne in front of me, my throat tight, but my face calm. I had learned long ago that silence was sharper than any outburst. The room felt heavy, the air thick with smugness. My phone buzzed in my clutch, a vibration that cut through the noise. I excused myself, my voice controlled, and stepped into the hallway. The line connected, and I spoke quickly, my tone shifting into command. Route secured, clearance confirmed, standby team ready. On the other end was Ava Brooks's publicist, finalizing the security detail for an award event. Ava had just won an Oscar the year before, her face plastered across magazines and screens. She trusted me to keep her safe when the world wanted a piece of her. I ended the call and slid the phone back into my bag. For a moment, I let myself breathe the cool air of the corridor, easing the heat that had built inside the dining room. Behind the double doors, laughter erupted again, Olivia's voice rising above the rest. I walked back in, composed, and returned to my seat. Olivia's eyes followed me, curiosity flickering behind her disdain. She hated not being the center of attention. I caught the way she whispered into Kyle's ear, her smile faltering as she tried to reclaim the spotlight. To her, I was still the seamstress, the quiet sister who patched hems and stayed invisible. She had no idea the conversation I had just ended was worth more than every toast she could ever give. Robert clinked his glass again, drawing attention back to the front of the room. He spoke about legacy and honor, words that had never been meant for me. I folded my napkin neatly and set it beside the untouched plate. My mind was already elsewhere, on the contracts waiting in Los Angeles, on the names and faces I was sworn to protect. The brunch carried on with polite speeches and orchestrated laughter, but I barely heard them. Olivia basked in their praise, Kyle nodding along like a shadow. They believed they were the future, untouchable and golden. I knew better. Families could pretend, legacies could be staged, but truth had a way of surfacing when least expected. When the plates were cleared and the guests began to rise, I felt Olivia's glare on my back. She could sense she had not broken me. That unsettled her more than any retort ever could. I walked out into the crisp New York air, the city pulsing around me, and thought of what was coming. The stage was being set, and the performance they planned would not end the way they imagined. The morning after the brunch, I left my hotel room earlier than usual, needing air before the rehearsals and photo sessions consumed the day. The hallway was quiet, except for the faint hum of housekeeping carts. As I passed by the suite reserved for Olivia and Kyle, their voices slipped through the cracked door. I slowed, every instinct telling me to keep walking, but the words pulled me in like a current. Robert and Eleanor's names were spoken first, followed by the word transfer. Olivia's tone was sharp, confident. After the wedding, we push for the documents, she said. The house, the accounts, all of it needs to be in my name. Kyle murmured something about timing, but Eleanor's voice cut in with a certainty that chilled me. You are the future of this family. We cannot waste resources on someone who chose a life with her hands instead of her head. I felt the sting like a blade, not because it was new, but because it was familiar. Their plan was not just about excluding me from a table. It was about erasing me from blood and paper. I stood in the hallway, invisible as always, but my pulse pounded with every word. My phone vibrated in my palm. Jason's name lit the screen. I stepped back, forcing my breath steady before answering. His voice was low, urgent. Connor Hayes is moving again, he said. He has been feeding fragments of your old contracts to a tabloid. They are framing it like you built Guardian Elite with stolen money. For a moment, the air around me seemed to tighten. Family on one side plotting to strip me of a legacy that was never theirs to take. Connor on the other clawing at the company I had defended in court. I closed my eyes, the voices behind the door blending with Jason's warning in my ear. Do you want me to shut it down now? Jason asked. Or do we wait? I pictured Olivia inside the suite laughing with Kyle about how easy it would be to corner our parents. I pictured Connor smirking at a reporter selling them lies with the confidence of a man who had nothing left to lose. Not yet, I said quietly. Timing matters. I will deal with both of them when the room is full and the lights are on. Jason hesitated, then simply said, Understood. Call me when you are ready. I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my bag. My fingers curled tight around the strap nails pressing into leather. The hallway seemed colder now, the noise of the city faint through the glass windows. I did not push the door open. I did not confront them. Confrontation was what they expected. Silence was my weapon, patience my shield. As I walked away, I felt the weight of their schemes pressing on me, but beneath it was a clarity that steadied every step. Let them think they were winning. Let Connor believe his stories would stick. There was a stage waiting, and soon enough the same mouths that mocked me would be forced to speak my name differently. By the time I reached the lobby, the bustle of guests and staff swallowed the echo of their voices. I adjusted my coat and stepped out into the cold New York air, the wind whipping against my face. I knew the next move was not mine to make just yet. It would come when the eyes of everyone they wanted to impress were fixed on us. That was when the truth would matter most. The wedding day arrived with a sky so clear it almost felt staged. The plaza glistened with white roses climbing the banisters and crystal chandeliers already lit before noon. Guests poured into the ballroom in black tie, their voices a hum of compliments and speculation. I walked in alone, wearing a tailored navy dress that said nothing and everything at once. A hostess with a clipboard looked at my name, hesitated, then guided me to the farthest table near the exit doors. I sat down without protest. From where I was placed, I could hear the swish of servers' trays and smell the draft every time the doors swung open to the service hall. Whispers circled the room. She barely belongs here. She has nothing to show. I kept my posture straight, my hands resting lightly on the tablecloth. I had grown immune to being treated like furniture, but even then the sting found its way under my skin. At the head table, Olivia glowed in her lace gown, Kyle clinging to her side as if he had won a crown. Robert beamed. Eleanor dabbed her eyes dramatically, and the guests clapped on cue. I watched the performance like an outsider, but my phone in my clutch buzzed with a silent reminder that my world existed far beyond this hall. The ceremony blurred into speeches, a parade of toasts that painted Olivia as the jewel of the family. My glass of champagne sat untouched. Just as another cousin stumbled through a joke, the ballroom doors opened again. The air shifted. A woman in a sleek black suit stepped in, followed by a small team carrying folders and press kits. Ava Brooks walked directly behind them, her presence lighting the room brighter than the chandeliers. Heads turned, conversations stopped, cameras flashed instinctively. Ava, in her emerald dress, cut through the crowd until she reached my table at the back. The silence cracked when she smiled at me. "Director Cole," she said warmly. "We need confirmation before 8 tonight. The papers are ready for your signature." A collective gasp rippled through the room. A glass shattered on the floor. I looked up to see Olivia frozen, her hand trembling around a stem of wine before it slipped from her fingers and spilled across the white linen. Kyle's jaw slackened, his face drained of color. Robert and Eleanor stared at me as if they had seen a stranger. I rose slowly, taking the folder Ava held out. The words were crisp in bold letters: Guardian Elite Security, awarded exclusive contract for the 2024 Academy Awards, $25 million, press release approved. Photographers surged forward, bulbs bursting in the corners of the room. Ava leaned closer, her voice low but caring enough to be heard. Congratulations. We could not do this without you. I nodded once, keeping my expression calm. I did not gloat, did not glance toward the head table. The truth needed no ornament. My signature marked the page, and the publicist lifted a phone to alert the outlets. Within seconds, screens across the ballroom lit with alerts, headlines flashing. Guests swarmed with questions, the hum now a roar. Olivia sat rigid, her smile cracked wide open, mascara smudging at the corners of her eyes. Kyle whispered frantically into her ear, but she did not respond. My parents looked smaller than I had ever seen them, their practiced pride collapsing into shock. I returned the signed papers to Ava, who clasped my hand briefly before leading her team back through the doors. The applause that had followed Olivia minutes before had turned into murmurs that wrapped around me like a new garment. I simply sat down again, smoothing my dress, letting the room choke on the contrast between who they thought I was and who I had become. The orchestra picked up a tune awkward and misplaced, trying to fill the silence that lingered after Ava's exit. But the damage was done. Every guest had seen the truth unveiled in real time, and as I lifted the untouched champagne to my lips, I already knew the night was far from over, because reactions have a way of spreading faster than headlines. Olivia stood suddenly, her chair scraping against the marble floor, and forced a laugh that rang hollow in the charged air. "It is just cheap PR," she said, waving her hand, as though the sight of Ava Brooks walking straight to me could be explained away like smoke. A few guests chuckled weakly, but the weight in the room was against her. Kyle's phone buzzed again and again at the head table. He answered once, then, twice, each time his expression sinking further. He whispered to Olivia, his voice tight. "They are saying we look like fools. Sponsors are pulling out." She froze, then gripped his wrist too hard, her nails digging into his skin, but he shook her off. My own phone lit up with a different storm. Headlines flashed across the screen, but one stood out. Connor Hayes was back, spinning a story that Guardian Elite had won its contracts by bribery, that the Academy deal was illegitimate. A tabloid banner screamed about scandal. I felt a flicker of anger, but I stayed still, my champagne glass poised in my hand. Jason Miller appeared at my shoulder, his presence quiet but firm. He slid a folder onto the table, his voice pitched just for me. "Cease and desist drafted. Do you want me to deliver it?" I met his eyes and gave a small nod. Jason walked toward the exit, where reporters clustered already on their phones. Within minutes, the letter would reach Connor's camp. At the same time, a familiar figure entered the ballroom. Detective Harris, from the LAPD's licensing unit, strode past the stunned guests, speaking briefly with the hotel manager before stopping at my table. His words carried enough to be overheard. "Guardian Elite Security is fully licensed and authorized under California law. The Academy has vetted every clause of this contract. Anyone suggesting otherwise is lying." Then he tipped his hat and left the message planted firmly in the crowd. The shift was immediate. Guests who had leaned toward Olivia now leaned back, murmuring apologies to one another. A respected national paper pushed a breaking update. Deal with Guardian Elite confirmed after strict review by Academy officials. Connor's smear dissolved as quickly as it had appeared. Olivia sank back into her chair, her face pale under layers of makeup. Kyle's phone buzzed once more. He answered, then closed his eyes in defeat. "They do not want to meet me anymore," he muttered. She turned on him in fury, but he stood and left the table without a word. The spotlight that had once adored Olivia now burned her. I finally set my glass down and walked the length of the room. My heels clicked against marble, echoing in the silence. When I stopped in front of her, Olivia raised her chin in a last attempt at pride. I looked into her eyes, steady and unshaken. "You were wrong about me from the beginning. I am not a seamstress anymore." Her lips trembled, but she said nothing. The guests held their breath, caught between pity and fear. I turned, letting the silence stretch. It was heavier than any applause. And as I returned to my table, I knew the collapse was not finished yet, because when a mask cracks in public, the pieces never stop falling. The ballroom had fallen into a silence so thick I could hear the clink of a fork against porcelain from across the room. Robert and Eleanor sat frozen at the head table, their shoulders slumped, as if the weight of every choice they had made for decades pressed down at once. Robert's eyes avoided mine, fixed instead on the linen folded in his lap. Eleanor dabbed at the corner of her eye, her hand trembling, though she tried to disguise it as grace. Olivia was unrecognizable from the woman who had swept into the room hours earlier. Her mascara streaked down her cheeks, the lace of her gown wrinkled where she had clutched it in her fists. The whispers from the guests had turned into pity, some shaking their heads, others pulling out their phones to capture what remained of her performance. She glanced wildly around the room looking for Kyle, but his chair was empty. He had slipped away minutes before his departure final, and loud, despite the silence. Connor's name buzzed across the headlines, now his smear campaign collapsing under the weight of the legal letter Jason had delivered. By the following week, his consulting license would be revoked, his name blacklisted across the industry. But in that moment, he was already finished, his credibility shredded. I stood and walked toward the doors, my heels steady on the marble. No one stopped me. Some stepped aside as if I carried something untouchable that could not be confronted. Outside the hotel, the night was cool, the city glowing with lights that felt more honest than anything inside that ballroom. I exhaled and let the air fill me, a calm rising where anger had once burned. When I boarded the plane back to Los Angeles the next morning, I did not look back. My work waited, my people waited, and the future that I had built piece by piece was still unfolding. Weeks later, I walked the red carpet at the Academy Awards, not as a guest hidden in the shadows, but as a partner. Ava Brooks spotted me from across the press line and crossed over, ignoring cameras flashing in every direction. She hugged me quickly, whispering loud enough for the microphones to catch. "No one protects me better than she does." The moment traveled faster than any headline. I stood beneath the lights, not as the forgotten daughter, not as the seamstress they mocked, but as the woman who had turned every slight into strength. The applause was not for my family name, not for a borrowed gown, but for the reality of what I had built. That night I looked out at the stage, the orchestra swelling the crowd, shimmering in their gowns and tuxedos. My mind went back to Chicago nights, bent over fabric, to New York dinners, where I was seated by the bar, to the courthouse, where Connor tried to erase me. Every piece of it had led here. Revenge had not been fire or fury. It had been patience, discipline, and the truth revealed at the right time. I believe now that justice does not always roar. Sometimes it walks in, quietly takes its seat at the table, and simply refuses to be moved. My family thought humiliation would end me, but all it did was sharpen me into someone they could no longer touch. So I leave you with this. When the people closest to you try to erase you, when they call you worthless or push you aside, what would you choose? Would you forgive and fade back into silence, or would you build a life so undeniable that the truth speaks for itself?